Ethan Cross was not the kind of person who believed in fate. He liked to think that things happened because of hard work, skill, or maybe luck, but not destiny. Standing in the grand hall of an alien palace wearing an outfit that felt both too tight and too fancy, he began to wonder if maybe fate had a hand in his life after all. He had been invited to the wedding of Princess Arya of the Thalor Empire, one of the most powerful alien races in the galaxy. His mind still struggled to understand why. Ethan was just a human engineer barely known outside his trade outpost on the edge of the galaxy. Why had they sent him an invitation? Why had the Thalor Empire chosen him out of all the human representatives to attend their royal ceremony? The invitation had arrived without warning, delivered by a ship that appeared out of nowhere. It was a grand envelope sealed with gold and silver, its contents written in alien script that Ethan had only begun to decipher with his basic knowledge of the language. You were invited as a guest to the royal wedding of Princess Arya to her chosen consort. Your presence would be an honor to us. Ethan had laughed at first. It had to be some kind of mistake, but after confirming with his superiors, he realized it was no joke. So, he found himself here, on this alien world, in a towering palace made of shimmering crystal that reflected the blue sky above. The whole place seemed to hum with a strange energy, and the air smelled different, filled with the scent of alien flowers and sweet incense. The Thalor themselves, tall and elegant beings, with silver skin that glowed faintly in the light, moved through the palace in flowing robes. Their culture, their traditions, were far older and more complex than anything humans had experienced. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he stood among the other guests, most of whom were alien dignitaries from various corners of the galaxy. They looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, as though wondering what a mere human was doing at such an important event. Some of the aliens had never even seen a human up close before, and Ethan could feel their eyes following him. He shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his collar. A polite smile rested on his lips, but inside, he felt more out of place than he ever had in his life. The ceremony was about to begin, and all he had to do was sit quietly in the audience, watch the royal vows, and hopefully not embarrass himself in front of the galaxy's elite. The throne room, where the ceremony was to take place, was grand beyond measure. The walls were made of what appeared to be living stone, growing and shifting in ways that made Ethan dizzy if he stared too long. Massive chandeliers hovered above, casting soft golden light over the room. The seats were arranged in a semicircle. Around the central altar, and at the front, stood the royal family. Ethan's eyes were drawn to Princess Arya, standing beside her father, the king. She was stunning, with long, flowing black hair that seemed to shimmer as if it contained starlight. Her dark eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the room with a cool, collected gaze. Her gown, woven from some kind of metallic fabric that shimmered like liquid silver, clung to her tall frame. Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at her beauty and presence. She was clearly accustomed to the attention of those around her, but there was something about the way she carried herself that made Ethan uneasy. He had heard rumors that she wasn't entirely happy with this marriage, that the king had arranged it more out of political necessity than love. The wedding ceremony began with an elaborate procession. Dignitaries from all over the galaxy filed in, offering gifts to the royal family. The music was strange to Ethan's ears, soothing, yet with an undertone of urgency that seemed to pulse through the very air. He tried to relax, but his mind kept racing. He had no idea what to expect. Then, as the ceremony continued, something unexpected happened. The traditional vows were about to be exchanged, but the Thalar custom was slightly different from human weddings. In their culture, the vows were not just a promise between the couple, but a binding ritual involving the closest witnesses at this point. Ethan had been lost in his thoughts, distracted by the beauty of the event. He had barely noticed the moment when the chosen witness, alien dignitary from a neighboring planet, stepped forward to assist with the ritual. The room fell silent as the dignitary, a tall alien with bright green skin and long tendril-like hair, approached the altar. But something went wrong. The dignitary, apparently displeased with the arrangement, turned to the king and spoke in low, hurried tones. There was an argument, one that grew louder and more heated as the seconds passed. It was clear that the dignitary refused to take part in the ceremony. Ethan's heart raced as the tension in the room thickened. The king's expression darkened, his regal demeanor cracking for just a moment. He turned to the crowd, his voice booming across the hall. "Is there anyone who will step forward and fulfill this important duty?" Ethan froze. He didn't want to get involved. This wasn't his place. He was just here as a guest. But before he could think, a strange impulse washed over him. He raised his hand, stepping forward as though someone else was controlling his body. I'll do it," Ethan said, his voice louder than he intended. The room fell utterly silent. The king and the princess turned to him, both expressions unreadable. Ethan felt every eye in the room upon him. He knew that this was a terrible idea, but there was no backing down now. "Human," the king said slowly, his voice like a storm brewing. "Do you understand the significance of what you are offering?" "I don't," Ethan admitted, his voice shaking slightly, "but I'll try." The princess' gaze met his. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, mixed with something else, something he couldn't quite place. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Without waiting for permission, the alien dignitaries around the altar began to prepare the ritual. Ethan, still unsure of what was happening, tried his best to remain calm. He stood next to Princess Arya, who was now just inches away. He could feel her presence, the weight of her importance, but at that moment, it didn't matter. Ethan's thoughts were clouded with confusion and nervousness. The ritual was quick. The dignitaries performed the necessary chants, and a strange energy washed over them. Ethan felt a sudden, sharp pull at his chest, like a tether being tied around him. It was unlike anything he had ever felt before, an invisible force binding him to something or someone. The princess flinched slightly and the crowd began to murmur. When the ceremony finally ended, Ethan's mind was reeling. He had no idea what had just happened, but the whispers around him were growing louder. He had no idea that by stepping forward as a witness, he had unknowingly bound himself to the princess, both in ceremony and in law. Princess Arya stepped away from him, her expression unreadable. The king's gaze was cold and calculating. But there was something else in his eyes, a sense of anger, and perhaps something more. Ethan felt the weight of their gaze and knew that nothing would ever be the same again. He had come here as a guest, but somehow he had become a part of something far bigger than he had ever imagined, and now he was tied to the princess of the Thaler Empire forever. Ethan Cross had never expected his life to change in such a way. He had gone to the royal wedding simply as a guest, hoping for a peaceful, uneventful day among the galaxy's elite. But now he found himself in the center of something far more complicated. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. He had participated in the royal bonding ritual without understanding its true meaning, and now he was bound to Princess Arya of the Thaler Empire, not just as a witness, but as something more. The room buzzed with hushed voices as Ethan stood there, feeling like a small speck in the middle of a massive, strange storm. The guests around him continued to murmur, their eyes darting from him to the princess and back again. The king, seated on his grand throne, looked furious. His sharp gaze never left Ethan, and for a moment, Ethan thought he might be struck down for his accidental interference in such an important ceremony. But it wasn't just anger that flickered in the king's eyes, it was something else. There was a coldness, an unspoken challenge, as if Ethan had unknowingly stepped into a game far more dangerous than he could ever imagine. The tension in the room thickened. Princess Arya, standing beside him, remained perfectly still. Her face was a mask of control, her dark eyes searching Ethan's with a quiet intensity. She didn't say anything at first, but Ethan could feel the weight of her gaze, as though she was trying to make sense of this new, unexpected situation. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain that he hadn't meant to cause any trouble, but the words stuck in his throat. He wasn't even sure if he understood what had just happened. The king's voice broke the silence, low and dangerous. "You human," he said, his tone like the rumble of distant thunder. "Do you understand the significance of what you've done?" Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. I didn't mean to, he stammered. I didn't know that this was part of the ceremony. I thought I was just helping. I didn't. The king raised a hand, silencing him with a single gesture. The entire room fell into an uneasy quiet. You have just bound yourself to my daughter, the king said slowly, each word dripping with a mix of disbelief and anger. You are no longer a mere guest human. You are now a part of our family, whether you like it or not. The gravity of the king's words hit Ethan like a hammer. He'd been joking with himself earlier, imagining that this could be some kind of misunderstanding, but this was real. He was now, in some strange alien way, tied to the princess. He could feel his pulse quicken, a sense of panic rising in his chest. The princess didn't speak at first, but her expression softened. Ever so slightly, as if she too were struggling to understand what had just occurred. After a long moment, she turned toward him. Her voice soft yet firm. It was not your fault, she said, her eyes meeting his with a strange mix of emotions. You didn't know what you were stepping into. Ethan wasn't sure if he should be relieved or even more confused. On the one hand, Arya seemed to be on his side. On the other, the entire situation felt like a massive, tangled mess that he had no idea how to fix. Before he could respond, the king spoke again. His voice was low, almost a growl. You will come with us to the palace chambers, human. We have much to discuss. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had no choice but to follow the king's command. The alien guards surrounding the hall moved. With swift precision, their eyes never leaving him, he swallowed hard and nodded, not trusting his voice to speak. As they made their way through the palace corridors, Ethan tried to keep his composure. The halls were even more impressive, up-close towering spires of shimmering metal and living stone, walls that seemed to shift and pulse as though they had a life of their own. Every step they took echoed in the quiet, and Ethan couldn't help but feel like a small, insignificant creature in such an imposing world. Princess Arya walked beside him, her presence calm and commanding. She didn't look at him, but he could feel her attention on him, sharp and intense. Ethan wasn't sure how to approach her. Was she angry with him? Was she frustrated by the situation? Or was she simply resigned to it? They reached a large chamber, its doors opening with a soft hiss. The room was filled with soft light, casting long shadows on the walls. A massive table sat at the center, covered in strange alien devices and holographic screens. The king took a seat at the head of the table, while Ethan and Arya were motioned to sit across from him. There was a long pause, the silence stretching between them. Ethan could feel the weight of the king's gaze on him, sharp and calculating. The king's voice broke the stillness. This will be resolved immediately. I will not have my daughter's honor questioned by the likes of a human, he said, his voice filled with authority. You will leave this palace immediately. You will not interfere again. Ethan opened his mouth, about to protest, but the princess spoke first, her voice steady. No, father, she said, her tone calm but firm. This is not Ethan's fault. He didn't know what he was doing. The king's expression darkened further.
Oh, and
Then whose fault is it, Arya? A human cannot simply step into the sacred bonds of our people without consequence. Ethan watched as the princess stood her ground, her posture unwavering. It was not intentional, father. There is no need to shame him for something he did. Not understand. The king's eyes flicked to Ethan and then back to Arya. There was a long pause, as if the king were weighing his options. Ethan could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between his royal pride and his desire to protect his daughter. Finally, the king spoke again, his voice more controlled. Very well, but there will be consequences. A human consort is unheard of. He paused, his gaze flicking back to Ethan. You will remain here in the palace. But know this, human, you will be under my watch and under my daughter's supervision. If you cause any trouble, if you disgrace this family, there will be dire consequences. Ethan swallowed hard. He had expected the king to be angry, but this felt like a threat, and not just any threat, something darker. The princess stood up and walked toward him. You will stay here, but I will help you understand. You are not my enemy. Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. She wasn't as cold as her father, at least not entirely. She was trying to make the best of this situation, just as he was. "We have much to discuss," the princess said softly. "But we'll start with the basics. You'll need to learn our ways if you're going to stay here." Ethan nodded, though he still didn't fully understand what was happening. The king had made it clear that there were no easy answers, and the road ahead was going to be difficult. But for now, he was stuck. He had no choice but to follow Princess Arya's guidance and hope he could survive in this strange new world. As they left the chamber, Ethan couldn't help but wonder how he had gotten himself into this mess. A simple wedding, a mistake. He was bound to the Thaler Empire, and somehow, the fate of more than just his own future seemed to rest on the strange, unspoken bond between him and Princess Arya. And the question echoed in his mind, what was he really getting into? Ethan's first few days in the palace were a blur. Everything around him was so different, so alien. The Thaler Empire was a vast, powerful civilization, and he was a stranger in the heart of its royal court. Each room he walked through felt like it had its own history, its own purpose, and he couldn't help but feel small, as though he were a child who didn't belong at first. It was hard to believe that he was even here. In one moment he was a simple engineer at a distant trade outpost, and the next he was the consort to a princess, bound by an ancient and mysterious ritual. He didn't know how to navigate this world of alien politics, royal customs, or strange technologies. The first few days passed in silence. The king rarely spoke to him, and the princess, while kind, seemed distant. She would speak to him in private lessons about Thaler culture, trying to explain what he needed to know in order to live in their world. But there was a coldness to her that he couldn't quite understand. It wasn't as if she hated him, but it was clear that this situation wasn't ideal for either of them. Their interactions were polite, formal, and at times awkward. She would teach him about Thaler traditions, their history, their rituals, and their rules. Ethan learned that the Thaler had a long and proud history, and their society was governed by a strict hierarchy. The king was the highest authority, and the princess was expected to marry a powerful, influential leader to ensure the stability of the empire. In this case, she had been promised to someone else, a noble from a neighboring planet. But now, because of Ethan's mistake, all of that was thrown into chaos. Ethan had tried to ask her about it once. He had tried to understand how she felt about the whole situation, but Arya had only replied with a calm, collected expression. She didn't seem angry, but there was something distant in her eyes, something that made Ethan feel as though she was holding a part of herself back. One afternoon, he sat in a vast garden within the palace grounds, the sunlight filtering through the thick emerald leaves of alien trees. The air smelled sweet and fresh, with a hint of something he couldn't quite place. Princess Arya joined him there, her footsteps silent on the stone path. She wore a simple robe today, one that wasn't nearly as ornate as the gowns she wore during formal ceremonies. She seemed more at ease, though her gaze was still sharp, her mind always calculating. "I thought you might want some time away from the palace," she said softly, her voice lacking the formal tone it often held. "You've been cooped up inside for days now." Ethan nodded, grateful for the opportunity to be outside. The palace was magnificent, but it felt suffocating at times, with its endless halls and rooms filled with foreign customs. Out here under the bright sky, it almost felt normal again, "Thank you," he said, sitting back on the stone bench. "Beautiful here. I didn't expect your world to be like this. I expected the palace to be grand, but this..." He gestured around him, his voice trailing off. Arya smiled slightly, her expression softening. "The gardens are a place of peace," she explained. "A place where we can forget about politics and power for a while." Ethan studied her face, trying to understand her better. Despite her regal appearance, she seemed different out here. More human, more like him. But there was still a wall between them, something invisible that kept her from truly letting go. "Is it hard for you?" he asked, his voice tentative. "To be here with everything that's happened?" Arya turned her gaze to the flowers in front of them, her fingers brushing lightly against one of the petals. "It's complicated," she said after a long pause. "This marriage, this bond, it was never something I chose. I was promised to someone else, someone powerful enough to secure the throne. But now her voice trailed off, as if she didn't know how to finish the sentence. Ethan felt a pang of sympathy. You didn't want this, did you? Maria didn't answer immediately, but her silence was all the answer he needed. She didn't want any of this, didn't want to be married to someone she didn't choose, didn't want to be tied to a human engineer who had made an honest mistake. I don't know what to do with you, Ethan, she said, her voice quiet. I don't know what this means for my people, for my father, for the Empire. You were never meant to be a part of this. And yet here you are. Her words stung more than he expected. He wasn't blind to the difficulties this had caused her. She was the princess, and now her life was even more complicated because of him. He could feel the weight of her words, the burden she carried, and he wasn't sure how to fix it. I never meant to cause any trouble, he said, his voice low. I didn't know what was happening. I just wanted to help. Aria's gaze softened, and she finally turned to face him. I know. I don't blame you for this. I blame the ritual, the tradition. But I don't know how we can undo it. They sat in silence for a long while, the sounds of the garden filling the space between them. Ethan could sense the growing tension in the air, the unspoken questions that neither of them dared to ask. What were they supposed to do now? What could they do? As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow across the sky, Arya stood up, brushing the dirt from her robe. Come, she said, her voice regaining some of its formality. There's something I need to show you. Ethan stood as well, unsure of what to expect. Arya led him through the palace grounds, past the towering columns and shimmering statues, until they reached a large domed building at the far end of the courtyard. It was a place he hadn't seen before. He could feel the air around it was different, heavier, somehow. This is the Hall of Ancestors, Arya explained. It's where we honor our family's history, our people's history. Inside, the hall was filled with ancient artifacts, scrolls, and statues of past rulers. There was a quiet reverence to the room, as though the very air was filled with the weight of centuries. Arya stopped in front of a large statue, one of a regal woman with an intense gaze and flowing robes. This is my mother, Arya said softly. She was a great leader. She was supposed to be my guide, my mentor, but she died when I was young. My father has raised me to take her place, but it hasn't been easy. Ethan stepped closer to the statue, studying the woman's stern face. She had an undeniable strength about her, a quiet power that commanded respect. He could see why Arya might feel the pressure to live up to such an image. I never knew what it was like to be in her shoes, Arya continued. But now, I'm learning that being in charge, being royal, it's not as glamorous as it seems. She turned to Ethan, her expression distant once again. I've always had a choice. My whole life was my father's choice for me. Now it's different. I didn't choose this. Ethan felt a strange understanding pass between them. He knew what it felt like to have his life turned upside down by forces beyond his control. They were both caught in situations they didn't want. But somehow, they would have to make the best of it. I don't know what's next, Arya said, quietly. But we'll figure it out together, won't we? Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure what the future held. He didn't belong here in the palace of an alien empire, but he had a feeling that the strange bond he had formed with the princess would take him to places he never expected. And as they walked out of the Hall of Ancestors, side by side, Ethan couldn't help but wonder if this unexpected journey had the power to change everything. Days blended into weeks as Ethan adjusted to his new life in the palace. He had been taught the basic customs of Thaler culture, but the more he learned, the more he realized how little he understood. Each day he attended lessons with Princess Arya, learning about their history, their laws, and the complex web of politics that held the empire together. He felt like an outsider in a world that was as beautiful as it was alien. Yet despite the weight of his new role, something had begun to change. The awkwardness between him and Arya had slowly faded, replaced by a quiet understanding. Carried herself with the dignity of a royal. But there were moments, rare moments, when the walls around her seemed to soften. When they spoke, it wasn't just about duty or tradition. Sometimes it was about the things they shared fears. doubts, and even laughter. Still, the tension between them was never completely gone. He was still an outsider, a human, while she was a Thaler princess, bound by the expectations of her people. They had both been swept up in something neither of them had chosen. But as the days passed, they learned to navigate this strange new reality together. It was on one of those days, in the heart of the palace, that things took an unexpected turn. Ethan had been summoned to the royal council chambers, a vast room, filled with alien leaders and high-ranking officials. They were discussing the future of the empire, a topic that Ethan knew little about, but he was required to attend. Arya sat beside him, her presence as regal as ever. The other dignitaries glanced at him with curiosity, their eyes a mix of interest and caution. The meeting had been going on for hours, and Ethan was beginning to lose track of the conversation. The Thaler spoke in a language he was still struggling to understand, and the atmosphere in the room was thick with political maneuvering. Every word seemed to hold deeper meaning, and Ethan felt like he was on the outside looking in. Then the king spoke. His voice was sharp and commanding, cutting through the air like a blade. "We cannot allow this marriage to continue," the king declared, his eyes flicking toward Ethan and Arya. "The human does not belong here. He's a distraction, a mistake we can no longer ignore." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had known that this union wasn't ideal for the king, but hearing it spoken aloud in front of the entire council made the situation feel suddenly very real. He had thought that maybe over time he would become a part of this world. But the king's words made it clear that he was still nothing more than an inconvenience. Arya's gaze never left her father's face, her expression unreadable. "Father," she said, her voice steady, though there was a tension in her tone. "This is not just about politics. This bond is more than that." The king scoffed. "A human, Arya? A human is nothing more than a passing distraction. You are my daughter, and you have a responsibility to the Thaler Empire." Ethan watched as the princess clenched her fists, her jaw tightening. He could see the struggle in her eyes. This was not just about their marriage. It was about her place in the empire, her duty to her people. "I am aware of my duty, father," Arya said, her voice cold now. "But this bond, this union, is part of my future. I cannot simply cast it aside." The room fell silent as the weight of her words hung in the air. The king's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking between his daughter and Ethan. "You would choose a human over the future of your people." Arya stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. "I am choosing what I believe is right, father. I am choosing to honor the bond, even if it is inconvenient for the empire." The king's face darkened. "Then you are no longer the heir to the throne," he said, his voice hard as stone. Ethan felt a pang of shock in his chest. He hadn't expected the king's reaction to be so severe. He knew that the Thaler were a proud people, but this was a declaration of war against his daughter, against everything she had been raised to believe. Arya did not flinch. She held her father's gaze unbroken. "Then I will find my own way," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. The king looked at Ethan one last time, his eyes filled with contempt. "You are a fool, human," he spat. "You have ruined everything." Ethan wanted to say something, to argue back, but the words stuck in his throat. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to say. How could he explain that he never wanted any of this, that all he had done was try to help? The council members murmured among themselves, their eyes flicking between the king and the princess. Ethan felt the weight of their judgment, the pressure of 1,000 alien eyes on him. He didn't belong here. He never had. Arya turned to him then, her face softened with a hint of sadness. "Come with me," she said, her voice low. "I need to speak privately." Ethan followed her out of the council chambers, his mind spinning. What had just happened? Why had the king reacted so violently? He had known that this marriage was a political tool, a means to secure the throne, but now it seemed like it was more than that. It was about power, about control. And Ethan had become a pawn in a game that he didn't even understand. They walked through the palace in silence, the weight of the moment heavy between them. Arya led him to a small, quiet room far away from the bustle of the royal courts. Once inside, she closed the door behind them and turned to face him. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice filled with quiet regret. "This is not what I wanted. For you, I never wanted you to be dragged into this." Ethan shook his head, trying to steady his racing thoughts. "It's not your fault, Arya. I didn't understand what I was getting into. Never wanted to cause this much trouble." She looked at him, her expression softer now. "But you did. And now, we both have to live with the consequences." Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know what to do anymore. Your father, he made it clear he doesn't want me here. He sees me as nothing more than a mistake." Arya's eyes flashed with frustration. "My father cares only about power. He doesn't care about what's right or wrong. He only cares about what will keep him in control." Ethan met her gaze, trying to understand. "And what about you? What do you care about?" She hesitated, her eyes searching his. "I care about my people. I care about my duty. But I also care about what's right. Right now, I believe that what's right is trying to make this work." There was a pause, as though both of them were trying to find the right words. "I don't know what that means," Ethan said quietly. "But I'll try. I'll try to help if you'll let me." Arya smiled faintly, though there was still a sadness in her eyes. "That's all I ask." They stood in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Ethan wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing: things were changing. The princess was no longer the cold, distant royal he had first met. She was someone who, despite her position, was trying to do what she believed was right. And Ethan, well, he wasn't sure what role he would play in the coming days, but he knew he couldn't walk away now. The king's anger was a storm that wouldn't pass easily, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could weather it together. As they stood there, side by side, Ethan realized that his journey in this strange world had only just begun. And whatever came next, he would face it with Arya at his side, no matter what it took. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in the council chambers. The king's words echoed in his mind. "You have ruined everything." Those words had stung more than he wanted to admit. He had never imagined that his accidental participation in the royal bonding ceremony would lead to something so complicated, something so dangerous. But now it was clear that things had only become more tangled. The king's anger hadn't eased. If anything, it had grown. Ethan had hoped that over time the king would accept him, that he would be seen as something other than a mistake. But that hope seemed foolish now. The following days were tense. The royal palace felt more like a prison with each passing hour. Every move Ethan made was watched closely, as though he were a guest in someone else's home who had overstayed his welcome. Courtiers, the guards, even the servants, they all treated him with barely concealed disdain. It was hard to ignore. The whispers that followed him wherever he went, the looks of judgment, the hushed conversations behind his back. Yet there was one person who hadn't turned away from him. Princess Arya. She had stood by his side when the king had thrown his rage in their faces. And she continued to stand by him, even though the consequences of their bond seemed to be pulling them both deeper into a crisis. But Arya was not without her own burdens. Ethan could see the weight in her eyes, the way she carried the responsibility of the empire on her shoulders. She was torn between loyalty to her father, duty to her people, and the strange, uncharted territory of her bond to Ethan. They had spent many quiet moments together in the days after the council meeting, talking about anything and everything that wasn't related to royal politics. It had become a kind of unspoken rule between them. When they weren't attending meetings or being watched by others, they found time to escape into their private conversations. That afternoon, Ethan was walking through the palace gardens, trying to clear his mind as the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the lush greenery, and the cool breeze made the leaves rustle gently. He didn't know where he was going, but it felt good to be outside, away from the stifling tension inside the palace walls. He rounded a corner and almost bumped into Arya. She had been waiting for him. It's as if she had known he would come. "This way, Ethan," she said, her voice soft but urgent. "I need to talk to you." He looked at her, noting the serious expression on her face. "Of course. What's going on?" She motioned for him to follow her, and they walked together in. Silence for a while. Arya seemed lost in thought, her eyes focused ahead. She was always calm, always in control, but something about her posture now seemed tense, uncertain. Finally, she stopped near a small fountain at the center of the garden. The sound of the water splashing against the stone was soothing, but the silence between them felt heavy. "I spoke with my father this morning," Arya began, her voice low. "He refuses to let you stay here. He says that your presence is a threat to the stability of the Empire. He believes that my bond with you will weaken our position." Ethan's chest tightened. He had known this was coming. It was only a matter of time before the king made good on his threats. "So what does that mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Arya's eyes met his. "It means that I'm being forced to make a choice." Ethan felt a knot form. In his stomach? What kind of choice? She took a deep breath, her eyes flickering with a mix of frustration and sadness. "I can either end this bond, disavow our union, and send you away or turn you to your people. Or I can choose you. I can choose to stand by you, despite what my father wants. But if I do that, everything will change. My place in the Empire will be destroyed. I will no longer be the heir to the throne." Ethan stared at her, his mind racing. This was the moment of truth. He had always known that Arya was caught in a difficult situation. She had a duty to her people, a responsibility to the Empire, and now she had to decide between that duty and the bond they shared. "I can't ask you to choose me over everything else," Ethan said, his voice strained. "You have your entire future ahead of you. You deserve to have control over your life, to make your own choices." Arya shook her head, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and determination. "It's not about what I deserve, Ethan. It's about what is right. And what is right is standing by you." Ethan's heart clenched. He had never expected this. He had never imagined that she would sacrifice so much for him. The princess, one of the most powerful people in the galaxy, was willing to risk everything. For a bond that had started as nothing more than a mistake. "You don't have to do this," Ethan said, his voice soft. "We could figure out a way to fix this. There has to be another option." Arya looked at him, her expression hardening with resolve. "There isn't. My father has made it clear. There is no room for compromise in his world." Ethan felt the weight of her words press down on him. The king was not going to back down. The princess had made her decision, and now there was no turning back. She stood by him. The consequences would be severe. "I'll stand by you, Arya," he said, his voice filled with a sense of purpose. "I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm not going to leave you alone in this." Arya's eyes softened, and for the first time in days, a small smile appeared on her face. "Thank you." But just as they stood there, sharing a rare moment of peace, the sound of hurried footsteps broke the quiet. One of the palace guards appeared at the far end of the garden, his face pale and worried. "Princess," he said, his voice urgent, "the king requests your immediate presence. There has been an emergency." Arya's face tightened, her expression becoming guarded once again. She turned to Ethan, her eyes dark with concern. "It's my father. He must have learned something about our conversation." Ethan nodded, understanding the unspoken message. They had to act quickly. He could feel the weight of the danger that was closing in around them. The danger that would come if the king discovered what they were planning. Together, they rushed back, toward the palace, the guard leading the way. The air felt thick with tension, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, something that neither of them could control as they entered the palace. They were met by a group of royal advisors, all of them speaking in hushed tones. The king stood at the center of the room, his eyes filled with fury. "Arya," the king said, his voice cold, "you've made your choice." The princess stood tall, her chin lifted. "I have, father, and I stand by it." The king's eyes narrowed. "Then you will have to face the consequences." He turned to Ethan, his voice dark. "You think you can simply waltz into my kingdom and destroy everything I've built? You're nothing but a mistake, human, and I will make sure you regret ever setting foot here." Ethan stood tall, meeting the king's gaze with a newfound determination. I'm not here to destroy anything. I'm here because I care about your daughter, care about what's right, and I'm not going to back down now. The king's eyes flared with anger, but there was something else there, too, something deeper, something more calculated. Then we will see how long your courage lasts. As the tension in the room mounted, Ethan knew that this was just the beginning. The battle between the king and the princess was far from over, and now he was caught in the middle. But one thing was certain. He would stand by Arya no matter the cost. Whatever happened next, he would face it with her because he couldn't turn back. Not now.